What we have here is a Maddog that won't start. You press the button, nothing happens. And before you say, you need to adjust your valves. They're already adjusted, so what's the issue? You may not realize it, but your Maddog starter system has smart technology. And what the smart technology does is it determines how far you are from home. And if you're a certain distance from home, the starter will fail. Now normally, the smart technology knows when you get back to the garage after you bring your bike home in the back of a truck and the starter starts randomly working again. But we've got a rare case where this didn't happen. The starter still failed and I'm in the garage. So this is going to be a good troubleshooting exercise. To troubleshoot your starter system, you really need a multimeter. And they're cheap. You can get them at Harbor Freight. This one's expensive. A good fluke costs over 400 bucks, so you might be scared if you see them on the internet. But you can get the little cheap ones. They do just as good for like $9.99. You always have a multimeter if you have a Maddog. Another cool thing is this light here. All this is one end goes to negative, one end goes to positive. And if you have 12 volts, it's going to give you a light. So I'm going to clip this onto negative, put it on positive, and there's the light. It's a little bit quicker and more handy than the multimeter, especially if you got to press buttons while you're troubleshooting. We'll be pressing the starter button a lot, so you need to understand the start system. Electricity can come in from the battery into this key switch. So the key, when you turn it on, we can send electricity out different places. One is normally to the fuse box. And on a Maddog, here's your fuse box. You got one fuse. That's a red wire. That's got 12 volts. Goes into your system and powers everything. The starter's a pretty big consumer. It's going to need a thicker wire. So this big red wire coming off of the battery is for the starter. That goes down into your wire bundle and it's going to come back out up in here. It's going to come out in this little round thing. That's called a starter relay. You notice the starter uses a big thick wire because it's a big consumer. A lot of current goes through that starter. It's 12 volts, but it has a lot of current going through it. If we tried to send that electricity through, let's say this wire that comes on when the key's on, it would just melt that wire. That wire's not heavy duty enough. We want to send it through a big wire like this. So how do we do that? Well, we put in something called a starter relay. Starter relay is this device. What this does is this connect this and this. To the casual observer, this is a negative wire and this is a positive wire, and this is some kind of device. What this actually is one wire. That's a positive and that's a positive. This thing is just a switch. So think of this wire as your starter wire. One wire, this goes from the battery and it goes through the switch and keeps on going to the starter. And this switch is going to turn the starter off and on because this switch has a big metal wafer in it, and that metal wafer can carry all this current where this little wire can't. That's got electricity. That's got 12 volts, and this one doesn't because the switch is off. Before you even troubleshoot your starter system, you want to make sure this battery is fully charged. That's probably the number one thing that causes starter issues, is that low battery. The low battery can also damage your starter. The starter is going to draw a certain amount of, I think it is amps, are these terms right? It's going to draw a certain amount of amps to make it spin. If this battery has 12 volts, it should be something like 12.7, then it's going to draw a certain amount of amps and spin it. The current runs through the wire. Let's say this battery only has 11 volts. It doesn't have the required volts to spin that starter. So what the starter is going to do is it's still going to draw the same amount of amps. The starter is going to pull way more power out of this to make up for the fact that the volts are low. So it's going to draw way more current, and you're going to have much more current going through your wires, and this wire will get hot. Everything will get hot because you're running a low battery. It's going to heat up, could melt, but it probably won't. And what will happen in your starter is it's going to damage the starter because it's going to get too hot. It's drawing too much current. That current turns into heat. So always have a good battery. These bikes will run with no battery. The AC system, the stator will feed your CDI will feed your coil, and the bike will run with a dead battery. So it's hard to know when your battery's low when you're out riding. If your battery's low, you can damage things. So keep up with your battery. The 12 volt system of this bike is separate. We don't really need it, but the starter does need a good 12 volt battery to work. And most of us are running LED lights. The LED lights barely require any amps, so they will still work with a low to almost dead battery. And the only way I'm really going to know my battery's current state is to test it with the multimeter. And this battery has 11.7 volts. So this battery's dead. We don't know why it's dead yet. I can't get the bike to run, but it may be because we tried to start it so many times, or it may be because it's not charging. So we'll have to see which one it is. When your battery charges up to 12.6 volts or above, somewhere in there, this thing might start. So let's charge the battery, get it up to power. You can see from this chart here what a good battery, what a kind of semi drained battery is and what a dead battery is. It's a lot more volts than you think. Okay, we've got our charged battery. Let's continue the troubleshooting. What we do is we run a little wire, maybe that thin or thinner. We run it from the starter switch up here. When you press that, it connects the wire going from the ignition to a wire going to the relay. So the ignition has to be on to get power from the battery via this fuse. Once this fuse gives it power, it can send that power to this whole switch handle thing up here. And that's also goes through this kill switch. So it's like two switches on here. We got the kill switch in the on position, so electricity is connected, then it goes through the starter switch. When you hit that starter switch, electricity goes down into this solenoid via these little wires right here. It's your littler wires. The solenoid, then it connects this wire to this wire, and it sends big fat wire juice right from the battery to this wire. This wire sends it down to the starter. So your first step in troubleshooting, and you don't even need the key on for this, because this wire is always hot. This is connected right to the battery. It's always got 12 volts. Here the key is off, and it's got 12 volts. So the first step is, let's jump this wire. Let's see if this relay's bad. Let's jump from here to here. It's not sparking in this case, is it? So if we jump that from there to there, that starter should turn over. So that tells us we don't have a problem with this. The relay might be fine. It might not be. We could have failed two things at once. We could have melted the whole system, but we know the relay is not the only issue. We do have power going into the relay. We can also test the relay by simply hitting the starter with this test light on this side of the relay. So the key's on, and we hit the starter button, and the light comes on. So I've got power going through this starter wire to the starter. Is the wire broken? Under this plastic thing under your seat, these Maddogs, the starter wire that they come with the kit from China is not long enough to make it on these stretched bikes all the way back to the starter. So what Maddog has done is they have put this goofy ass connector in here. It's a bolt, and it'll be taped in black tape. That bolts two big starter wires together. Underneath that black tape, it looks just like this. There's an eyelet, a bolt going through it. There's another wire just like this with an eyelet and a bolt going through it, going to the starter. And that's this wire here, this big thick wire. The problems these have is they come apart, they come loose, is the little bolt wears through the tape, like you see right there. You got bare metal coming out of that tape, and right now it's just hitting plastic and stuff, but eventually with enough rattling and riding, it's gonna hit metal, and it's gonna short the whole system out. Because this system does not go through your fuse, it's gonna create havoc. Melt stuff, it's going to spark stuff, it's going to catch stuff on fire if it were to happen, and this fuse is not going to protect it. Remember, that wire goes directly to the battery, so when it touches ground, it's going to do damage. But that's a while down the road. It has to wear through paint and wires and things like that. So I don't like this system. I'd prefer to replace this with a solid wire, which I've done on another bike. That's why I have this. I ran one wire all the way back. But we can see if that wire has been broke or disconnected by simply touching the starter wire at the starter with our test light. The whole starter is a negative. This is the positive. The fact the starter is bolted to the engine is where its negative comes from. I'll turn the key on. Now you can hear the relay working. I press the starter button. You can hear it. You guys will have to pull your brakes on for this. It turns into like a kind of a three-handed operation, but I've got the brake switch bypassed. Even though that relay is working, it could not be making contact. But let's see if it's making contact and getting power back to the starter. Look at there. That's got power going to it. So we got a good relay, we got good wiring, we got a good start switch, we've tested that, and we've got a good ignition switch. That only leaves one thing. It leaves a bad starter. We've troubleshot everything else. So your first step in roadside maintenance when you got a bad starter, you take your handy rock here that you found on the side of the road and you pound on the starter. Well, that's a bad idea. If you're gonna pound on the starter, hit it up here. You're pretty safe right there where this metal plate is. Don't ever hit it here. So back in the day, these starters, they had shoes, pole shoes on them. They were little pieces of metal, about that big, that went around the starter, and you had a screw that held them on. There's no screws here. That would create a magnetic field. Today, they're permanent magnet starters. That means the magnet is permanently glued to this starter housing. So this is magnetic. So your stuff sticks to it. If you wrap on the outside of this with a rock or a hammer or a screwdriver, you could break those magnets. And you most likely will. When you break those magnets, it breaks the field. The magnets can delaminate, fall off, and get stuck on the armature inside here, and this starter's junk. It has to be thrown away. The purpose of beating on this starter is there's brushes in the starter inside here, and we'll look at these. They go down and touch the commutator, and that's the copper end of the starter. When those brushes get used, and the starter gets old, and the brushes get short, and when they get dirty, the spring tension on them won't push the brush all the way to touch the commutator. So what we're doing is we tap on this, we're jiggling that spring down and jiggling that brush down so it touches the commutator and it'll start. That's what we're trying to achieve by tapping on the starter, is to get that brush to set. The armature end of the commutator that sits in between the brushes has copper segments on it. The brushes are in a holder that has springs on it. The two most likely things that's wrong with your starter are the brushes have worn down to the point that the springs no longer can push them into the commutator. That's just natural, normal wear. The other issue is when we started the bike with a low battery, the electricity goes into the brushes and it uses magic to spin this starter. That magic needs these commutators to be separated for that to work. So either the commutator has got so gummed up, the little cracks between it, with brush material that also conducts electricity great, or the low starter has melted two segments of the commutator together and we end up with too big of a segment. And if we get too big of a segment under that brush and the starter parts just right, it won't move. The magic won't happen. These go all the way through and hold the starter to the gear housing. Let's check this out. Looks like the magnets are not cracked. Got good magnets. The brushes, they're in fair shape. They've got good spring tension. That's not probably our issue. Yeah, so future reference, bead on this end, right up here on this aluminum, if you want to get your brushes to sync, because that's where they are. These two here, they're kind of clogged up. You can see that, how it's clogged up right there. It's the only one I can find a problem with is that one there. You can take a razor blade and you can kind of scrape the gunk out of those and clean them up. See where the brushes have been running and they're all kind of clogged up. So it's good to kind of clean those out. We'll do that for all the cracks and get all that junk out of there. On the good segments, you can take that razor blade and slide it right through that crack with no resistance. But on a few of them, they seem to be clogged, so we want to get that groove back in there. Make sure these two segments are separated. Sometimes your Dremels will come with these ultra thin little cutters. Even little saw blades that are like paper thin. And this is a good use for them. They'll fit in that groove right there. And you can use that to clean these grooves out. So I've got two grooves that are kind of melded together. And that's probably my problem. There's only two brushes, unlike some starters have 4 brushes to prevent this. But this only has 2, so it exaggerates the problem. If one of the brushes is stuck here, it's not going to turn. The magic's not going to happen. There's usually a phenolic or a plastic ring those sit on, so if you go too deep and hit that, no big deal. These are completely separate. The electricity comes in via that tab. Those will be melted off sometimes. If your starter gets stuck on, they might be spun off. But yeah, as long as we get those grooves nice and separated, we should be good. Or here's a novel idea. You could just buy a new starter, but I kind of like fixing things. The next thing you want to do is clean this armature up. You can take some emery cloth like you get in the plumbing section at Home Depot. But basically just going to sand this armature all the way around. Get it back to shiny, but we're going old school. All this stuff is waterproof, so if you don't have a compressed air, you can spray it off with your water hose. We're going to re-grease it anyways before we put it together. So everything can be sprayed out with a water hose or blown out with compressed air. Get it all nice and clean. We got the armature clean now. We just want to clean up everything else. You want to get that dust and dirt out of here or anything that would prevent these brushes from flowing smoothly. You have to clean off the brushes. Clean all inside there, get all that crap out of there. You can spray this out with carb cleaner, also like carbon choke cleaner. Just want to make sure it's all dry before you put it back together. And something I didn't mention, this one has an alignment mark on it, and that's important to get the orientation right. And there's where the alignment mark lines up with, so it goes like that. But if you can't find an alignment mark on your starter, go ahead and mark it. See all that dirt come out of there? That's all the stuff we want to get rid of from years of sitting outside and years of use. Never pass up an opportunity to make your part high performance, and red makes everything high performance. Don't forget that O-ring right there. There's an O-ring here and an O-ring here. Definitely want those in place. Keep the water out, keep it from shorting out on you. You want this shaft to be greased, but you don't want the grease to get up inside here. So I don't usually put grease on the shaft. I'll put it in there. So when I slide the shaft in, it doesn't all ball up in here by the brushes. I want these brush area to be really dry. I'll take some grease and I'll kind of paint it in there. On this O-ring too, it'll slide in nicer. Grease on your gears that mesh, that's a good place for it. Now to slide this in, the housing, you have to hold these brushes in place. It takes 3 hands or all your fingers. But we've lucked out this is not a 4-brush system. These little wires on the brushes slide back in little grooves right there. So you can't just throw them in any way. You've got to get it where that goes back in the groove. So the wire can slide back in there like that. So you got to hold that one in while you put this one in. Put the wire in the groove and slide her back in there. One is a negative, one is a positive. This one's grounded to the case. Case is grounded to the ground. That's your positive. Negative, positive brush. Now we're going to have to try to fit our armature in there while it's like this. So get the armature going down in the little hole there, and your brushes are going to come out. That's why you don't want to grease on that shaft. I shouldn't even grease those gears actually. You'll get grease on your bushings. We've got it down that far, but the brushes have come out. We can't put our fingers in there to get them on top of that armature. We're just going to take this pick. I'm just going to pull these brushes back one at a time. Get the armature to kind of go sideways enough to cock over and hold that one. Got that one on. Push this one back. There we go. Now I got the brush set in there. Now what's going to happen next is we're going to put that magnet on here. When we put the magnet on, it's going to suck this thing back up into it, and we're going to lose our brushes again. Down inside there, we want grease in that too. I don't want to put it on the shaft, so I don't want it to gum up when I slide it on. I want to go ahead and put grease down inside that bearing. It's really just a bushing. There's no bearing there. I'm not even going to take a chance of it sliding out of my fingers. I'm just going to grab it with some vice grips. Doesn't have to be real tight, so we're not going to dent this shaft or anything or mar it up. Just a nice snug hold so the magnets don't pull that through. Now we can slide this on. Make sure you got your O-ring in place. There you go. Got it lined up with the alignment marks. We'll put our screws in. They're kind of fun to get in there sometimes because the magnets try to take control of them. Locating the holes gets to be extra fun, but you'll know when you've located the holes because it'll stick up like that. If it's all the way down like that, you probably missed the hole. Okay, there's our high performance racing starter. Now if you want to make it a high torque starter, just find a sticker you have laying around. Well, that sticker's too long. Cut that one in half. Perfect. You see the advertised a lot. It's kind of a funny term to me. A high torque starter usually has a gear reduction. It's harder to stop that gear because of the gearing inside the starter. If it's a direct drive like this, it can use planetary gears to do that reduction. So it could look like this, but it'd be too big to fit in there. There actually is some good videos on YouTube where they take these starters apart and show the difference, and there actually is a difference. If you get a real high output starter, it's actually physically a bigger starter. The armature's bigger, commutator's bigger, and the starter's physically bigger itself. I'm not even sure how it fits in there. But yeah, that'd be for real, a high output starter. So we'll call this a high output, not a high torque. That's what the HO will stand for. There we go. So now we have a hose starter. Your high output starter you buy from like Bingjing, and they will warn you to use a larger battery, a 9-amp battery. If you do a search on the internet, these Maddogs, it says they take a YTX7 battery, but they've all come with YTX9 batteries as far as I know. And I always replace them with YTX9 batteries, so we do have 9-amp batteries. But if you have a 7-amp battery, I would want to upgrade it anyways, not even just if I had a high output starter. I think a 7-amp battery is too small for this thing. And that's your YTX9. You hook your wire up first, it makes it a little bit easier. Just basically try to shove it back in there. On the teeth mesh, it'll hit this area right here. When it's flush with that, it's in there. Alright, the hose starter is installed. Pretty simple job. Turn the key on, hit the starter. Perfect.